everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Josie Foss, the Executive Director of the Progress and Poverty Institute here in Princeton, New Jersey. I am thrilled today to be joined by two of our Progress of Ideas grantees, Professor Hallie Aiken of Arizona State University's School of Sustainability and Professor Vanessa Lewick of the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions in Vancouver. Welcome. We are going to be talking today about a really exciting research project that these two professors have undertaken called Reconciling Urban Growth with Water Scarcity, Limits to Adaptation or Opportunity for Policy Innovation. So a very provocative subject and title, and I'm really excited to get started. So welcome. My first question for you both is, your research focused on the relationship between urban growth and water scarcity in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Why did you decide to study this particular issue?
Thank you.
Shall I take it?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So the most practical answer is the two of us were already working together, and we had published an article in World Development which highlighted the complex and important role of urban planning and urban development in adaptation. But I think probably more interesting answer is a little bit longer. We're both interested in adaptation and adaptation governance, in limits to business as usual, and I can go into what we mean by that, and then also the urban growth machine. So both of us are interested in how different actors with different stakes, how they negotiate or influence the different directions that adaptation may take. So in Arizona water, in this situation, how they were attempting to influence Arizona's response to water scarcity. And then the limits to business as usual. So what that really is which or what climatic stress or stressors lead to disjunctures or splits or reframing of problems, or challenge accepted narratives, or cause folks to start to renegotiate or rethink social contracts. And social contracts are the relationship between the public citizens and then their governing body. And in Arizona, what we're really interested in is right now, is this water issue enough to reframe or to challenge the narratives or to challenge the current social contracts? And then finally, the urban growth machine, the third part that really brings us together. It's the idea that municipality, it's talking about the connection and the complex and nuanced picture of municipalities and the relationship to and with growth. And it's basically about land-based interests and how they play an important role and a strong role in municipal politics and municipal planning. And some would argue, and sometimes we do too, to the detriment of equitable solutions and approaches, as well as often it kind of leaves out or pushes out the consideration of growth externalities. And the urban growth machine has a strong history in Arizona. Is water stress enough to start maybe shifting that or changing it? And if so, how?
Really important question to answer, absolutely. And you already alluded to the complexity of this topic and all of the constituents who are in the mix in different ways. How did you approach the research? What was your methodology? How did you capture all these perspectives and make sense of them?
Yeah, maybe I can get a stab at that. My strength is in the qualitative space, so my research really focuses on decision making and what are the factors that we take into account when we make decisions. And I've done a lot of kind of more qualitative ethnographic work, and Vanessa is really skilled. She has a law background, so she has more of the kind of policy and legal vocabulary and capacities to analyze some of the kind of policy circumstances. So we make a really good team in trying to understand both the kind of institutional context and then the kind of cognitive text of negotiating water scarcity at this moment of time in the urban development space. So I get really excited about hearing what people's stories are, and not because these fascinating issues, but I actually think that narratives and the stories that we tell about our relationship with each other, about the environment, actually have an influence on the built environment. They have an influence on policy. And many of these stories are kind of implicit. These narratives don't get questioned, and they get repeated and repeated, and they end up kind of making us blind often to what are some of the potential real pitfalls in the pathways that we're pursuing. And so one of the things that Vanessa and I have been interested in is about how narratives of growth, and this is where the growth machine comes in, because it's kind of like growth is always positive. It's always this kind of good that we must pursue. And we don't seem to always question it. And it ends up kind of sidelining issues of risk and how that risk is evolving and who's bearing the burden of that risk. And so what we were interested in is looking at media reports, looking at policy documents, trying to understand how that narrative is playing out. And then through interviews, who are the actors that are associated with particular narratives? And how are they kind of politically mobilizing those narratives as this crisis or, you know, this feeling of shift in the environment is kind of plowed in the Phoenix area. So that's where interviews seemed like the right way to go. So we combined kind of looking at the media, the reports that were coming out, the kind of discourse, but also talking to people. And I think also it's really important to recognize that because this is a very political topic, you know, can we develop, should we develop, how should we develop as water issues become more prominent? We to do this in a way that would make people feel comfortable, but also elevate kind of diversity of perspectives on this so that we're not necessarily in research trying to foreground anyone, but rather allow these voices and all the kind of cacophony of opinions kind of become visible so we can kind of see how these and maybe even see where there's some commonalities rather than just the conflict.
I love a qualitative study. I feel like that is such an effective way to kind of make sense of, especially situations where you have a lot of diverse narratives, which certainly this is one of those situations. And I know one of the sort of central through line was this changing perception on the ground, right, in terms of water and what it meant for the growth machine, what it meant for future development. And it seems as if there was this longstanding sense of like, it's a risk, but it's a manageable risk. And so we have these sort of government structures that can guarantee access to water, and we can count on that, and we can build with that as our backstop. And the reality of water in Arizona isn't necessarily exactly that, right? And it feels as if you all have come to a point where that's becoming clearer. So what is that looking like on the ground as that kind of maybe a bit artificial narrative is having to come to terms with the reality of water in Arizona? What does that look like?
Yeah, maybe Vanessa can jump in here too. But you know, I think one of the things that we're really interested in is this kind of interplay between the physical risk of water and then the kind of institutional, you know, how different there's, you know, really we're grappling with, is there an actual limit to water or to development because of water? Or is it really, do they just want to reframe this as kind of policy creating problems for them and the institutions being the risk? But I don't know, Vanessa, do you want to jump in here?
Oh, I think that's a really key piece of it, and going to the relationship between how are they imagining their relationship or their social contract with the state, but also with the municipalities.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I think was really you know, interesting is that Arizona is actually celebrated for some of its institutional innovations stemming from the 1980 Groundwater Management Act. So nationally, and even we in the interviews, people say, compared to Houston, compared to Florida, you know, Arizona is really in a good place. But what's interesting about those institutions, which really are about managing risk, and you know, concern about groundwater depletion led to some really innovative ways of saying, look, developers have to consider 100 years into the future whether water is going to be available, which is kind of unprecedented, nationally, of that long-term vision being institutionalized. But the critical thing is that there was this loop, which allowed developers to continue. I mean, people debate whether we should call it a loophole or not, but a way of locking the kind of institutional evolution so that they could continue to use groundwater through this kind of manipulation of where paper water rights are located. And it allowed them to kind of deflect the risk and say, as long as we're abiding by the law, we can just do this. And what we're seeing now is that institutional mechanism kind of coming into head with the physical risk. And a growing recognition that we really need to carry those better and couple, they are coupled. We can't just have these kind of be managed separately. And I think while we see some actors trying to really undermine, in some senses, with their discourse, that closer coupling of the physical and institutional, what was, I think, promising is that we had a lot of actors who really seemed to see the value in shoring up that institutional context and recognizing that if you have institutions which provide certainty but are not linked to the physical water risk, are not closely coupled, ultimately that's going to be a fragile state and it's going to come home to hurt them. And they were kind of advocating for a much more closer relationship than has been done in the past.
Yeah, I think some examples of that are, for example, designated providers and cities who are designated providers. They're needing to think about their water budget differently, and they're having to recalculate where are we actually going to be getting our water from, and they're having to take into account much more uncertainty than they have in the past. Because they don't know necessarily where the next, as they say, the next bucket will be coming from. And they have to think a little bit more strategically than they did in the past, and think about the cost of the extra infrastructure. So that's one definitely on the ground shift that we noted. And there's a couple others if you would like to hear those.
Absolutely, yeah. If you want to give a little overview of the additional, that would be great.
Sure. So one of the ways, one example, and that hit the national press, so I think that one's actually a good one to mention, so people have probably seen that, is that Scottsdale, they had an informal agreement to what's called a wildcat development to provide water, and they pulled that. So they're like, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And that's a very clear shift. There's also cities are drawing up policies, or they're actually in practice, even if they don't necessarily have the policy there, requiring developers that are proposing high water use. So the easiest that, once again, that most people will equate with is a data center, but there are others. They're requiring them to go through additional steps to prove that we will not use too much water, or to institute extra forms of water conservation. We definitely saw those. And this is quite interesting because it's starting to shift. Well, and in some cases, they're actually even requiring them to bring in water rights and give them to the city or pass them on to the city. And that's really interesting because this is exactly what we were looking for. Are there shifting responsibilities for managing risk between public and private? And might this be altering or pushing or changing the urban growth machine?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me that's the really interesting, one of the questions we have in climate change adaptation is that, are there going to be thresholds that really kind of alter business as usual? And what are those thresholds like? And who, what are the circumstances that lead to those thresholds? And so this is a really interesting case in which we're seeing some of these dynamics, and we don't know how they're all going to play out because there's also some legal action now that's trying to kind of pull things back to the way they were before. But I think citizens are now much more aware. And so we just saw a data center issue kind of explode onto the press in Tucson, where citizens are protesting and upset about plans for water use and cities. And this is where I think what's really interesting is in terms of social contracts, is how cities in these circumstances are kind of having to kind of make visible who are they really responsible to, and who's going to be around in 30 years, and what is the responsibility. And I think that's what's really interesting about this, is to see some of these issues kind of emerge and be more visible, where before we could kind of, growth is good for everybody and we'll all benefit, and now there's some new questions about this. And of course, one of the other interesting things that I think is that the Phoenix metro area demonstrates, and I think other places in the US probably have these characteristics, kind of a core municipal that have had an opportunity for growth. And so they may be in a better position now to kind of say, okay, we can take some more proactive stances versus those that feel like it's their right to kind of fulfill their destiny and fulfill their municipal area. And it kind of mirrors the, kind of international discourse about development and climate change. So it's a kind of interesting dynamic on the local level.
Really, it really is. It feels like Arizona is confronting some of the issues that we're all confronting, but maybe aren't quite as haven't quite admitted yet that this is the reality. And it feels like this conversation started long enough ago that you are now at the point where it's kind of iterative, and okay, this is what we thought initially, and it didn't really play out. And now how do we course correct? And of course, there's going to be actors who want that original bargain, right? Because they
Right.
probably bought it at that level. And it's just incredibly, incredibly interesting. Affordable housing, this is one of these top of the fold issues all over the country and the world, but, all over the country for sure. How does water scarcity, what does that mean in the context of the Phoenix metro area? How is it affecting prices, or will it? How is it affecting where housing is getting built? What does it look like there in terms of
Yeah.
those impacts?
I mean, I think that the jury is still out on this. I think we'll see the implications over time. But what was interesting for us in this, and this goes back to our kind of focus on narratives, is that the narrative that the water, so, for those of you, who are listening who haven't seen, this work that we do, there's a moratorium on new groundwater development, groundwater dependent development on some of the peripheral areas of Phoenix. And that was heavily protested by particularly home builders who saw this as impediment to their business prospects. And we're tying this discursively to a parallel crisis in the Phoenix area that's reflected nationally, where there hasn't been enough housing stock, particularly in for lower income residents, and that this somehow would be an impediment to achieving more affordable housing. Well, we're not housing experts, but we consulted with a lot of them, and most agreed that this was a political narrative. That yes, of course, as water price increase, and they will increase as competition for the available rights becomes more acute. But the kinds of housing that's being built on the periphery is not affordable housing. These are in the 500,000 range. These have a lot of desert amenities. These are things that are not located near lots of jobs and require the transport to get to. So we're talking about two different issues, that have to be addressed through different types of policy mechanisms. And the housing crisis is a national, it's has evolved with supply chain issues. It's related to post-COVID issues, mortgage rates. This is not driven by, and it existed before these water concerns. So yes, water prices will be transferred through utilities to ratepayers. You know, these are going to be different mechanisms where we're going to have to, as Arizonan residents, think about how water will affect the cost of living here. But we have very low water prices in general. Doesn't mean that people don't have access to high quality water in inner cities and such. But in general, you know, I think the affordable housing crisis is something about, you know, in development, multifamily development, something that politically is also really difficult to accomplish in our state. And you know, that's where the policy attention, most of the experts we reviewed talked, you know, that's where we need to be focusing. And in fact, we might have to focus as a result of this water issue to build in the infill, because that's where water and water portfolios are most closely managed right now. And so that may be the opportunity, kind of the silver lining, you know, of where new development will have to occur. I don't know, Vanessa, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Well, I just thought it was really fascinating how several folks from the periphery, when we would bring that up in the interviews, would say, well, the people who are buying these houses, they're not going to notice that price increase. It's going to be like, how did it go? 10 spice lattes or something along those lines. I was thinking,
a granite countertop or something.
That's right. The
It's
granite
going to be
countertop.
imperceptible. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that I think is interesting is that because of this, the institutional mechanisms that have been used to enable kind of peripheral sprawl may need to be changed, and particularly those cities on the periphery now may need to be one of the policy options is for them to become designated water providers, which means that they will have to have a budget, which they then allocate, which gives a huge responsibility back to the municipality, where today it's more distributed among individual developers and they kind of this patchwork and mosaic. But if this is transferred back and if they're able to kind of be designated, that means that those costs become something that is kind of more integrated across the municipality, and that it's not just like the new growth has that as kind of part of their property, kind of they think of it as kind of a property fee or something for just those. It becomes part of this municipal responsibility, and that, you know, does mean something. It means shifting again risks to a general population and more cost to the general. So those are things that I think politically will be interesting to see how those play out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that kind of leads to my next question. I think, you know, when we think about this type of topic, it's really easy for it to become very doom and gloom. You know, water's limited, the sky is falling. But clearly in your research, you found areas of innovation. You found some bright spots where things are happening on the ground that, you know, will probably produce good results. And, you know, in the same way that Arizona is kind of leading the charge in this kind of thinking, perhaps these could be generalized to other places. Can you talk a little bit about those bright spots, about the innovations that you see happening on the ground?
Sure. Vanessa, do you want to go or do you want me to?
Sure, I can go. I can start at least. I actually think that this is also a little bit tied to your next question, so I'll try not to bleed in too much, but I might end up doing that. So collaboration is one of the areas where it's been quite, I was excited seeing the there's always been, or always since 1976, I believe is when AMWA was formed, but there's been collaboration in the valley between some of the older municipalities. But that collaboration appears to be expanding, and not just between municipalities, but also between public-private organizations as well as fully private. And I think that that's really exciting. And I think that's a really important and good direction, especially considering that many of our interviewees brought up the need for a larger, almost steering organ. And this collaboration is a way of leading towards that, or at least discussing that. So, are the first foundation. So I think that that's a really exciting one. And
Yeah.
another one that Hallie already mentioned. Oh, did you want to say more, Hallie?
No, no, no. I was just gonna
Oh,
get
okay.
in there. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
going along. Yeah, we're both
Yeah.
excited. So maybe I should just say me, but both of us. There's also what Hallie brought up earlier, the recognition of the value of the public institutions that Arizona already has. And I think that that's an important piece. And then thinking about how these can be either redesigned or added to or strengthened. Of course, Hallie also already mentioned that there are folks who want to change this, and some of the lawsuits that are pending right now could actually undermine this completely. But it's actually still I think, a good news story because most people were really interested and excited and proud of these laws.
Yeah.
And then the engagement of developers with water, that was another really big one. It was fascinating. When we would ask about what's changed over time when we were talking to the folks, they would say, well, it used to just be an administrative hurdle. It was really actually just kind of annoying and didn't really think of it if we could help it. But now developers are actually engaging and they're starting to understand the relationship and the importance of thinking about this water. And that's exciting.
Yeah. Maybe I could
Um,
jump in here about
yeah, please.
the I mean, one of the things I'm most excited about because I study adaptive capacity, and so like what capacities exist in systems to respond. And one of the things that I thought was fascinating was in talking with different municipal planners and water managers, how they described the growth of their own capacity to manage growth effectively. And so we in a previous presentation that Vanessa and I did, and it's a conference, we taught it as kind of growth being the tail that wags the dog. It's like it's the value and the technical departments just kind of provide the facility for the growth to happen, and it's kind of as Vanessa said, these administrative hurdles. But what we're now seeing is kind of shift, and the dog is gaining control of its tail, and you have the not only the water managers speaking up, but actually a kind of interaction between water managers and urban planners that we didn't
Yeah.
see before. We talked to some urban planners would just say, oh, water policy just makes my head real. It's just technical and, confusing, and it is. I agree. But we saw that they really were making efforts to understand and to speak to each other before permits were given. And then the really critical thing, which I think goes back to the urban growth machine, is that they were engaging with the politicians, so the city council, and really trying to educate city council members about these risks, and help here. So we saw, rather than kind of the politics of just like we want this growth and it's good, but actually those technical experts having a little bit more direction and communication with the city councils. And so that to me is really promising because it gives us some ideas about the value of science, the value of knowledge in policy, and then the really critical importance of bridging silos. And so getting out of those, oh, I'm a planner and I just deal with zoning and I just deal with water infrastructure, but actually, we need to kind of see what those implications are, what those system level dynamics are. And so that to me was really exciting. And I think also with the increased engagement citizens in this is a really positive. Sorry, Vanessa, I got so excited.
Oh,
I
no.
jump in
Yeah,
there.
no, it's good. I think that's a really important one. And it wasn't just in one place, and it wasn't just in the core cities. It was also in the periphery where there's a lot of pressure to keep on developing that land that isn't used in the typical sense. And so I think that no, I'm really glad that you talked about that. Um, I think there are a couple others. Well, we talked about the citizenry. I think there's one other, and I think that one that I would like to bring up now, it's that how developers are contributing to public ends. So there have been agreements in the past where developers were already contributing somewhat to public ends, but now that's growing. And to the point where they're sometimes agreeing, not even that they're forced to, but they're agreeing as part of the negotiation process to bring water rights, to acquire them, to make it possible. But then also on their own private, so that's the public part, but also in these master plan communities, in some places they are starting to implement I guess, water conservation measures and ways to retain water on their own land. And I think that that's a really important development, one that's needed with so many master plan communities in Arizona. Um, the one challenge with that is that you do need to keep leadership, a strong public leadership to make sure that it still is serving public interests.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
a minor caveat considering how important it is to have some of these infrastructures on private land. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we may see in other sectors as well, like energy,
yeah.
of, how do private actors and their responses have these positive externalities for the public? And what are the mechanisms through which governance can actually facilitate that in a collaborative sense rather than a coercive sense? And to keep that public good in mind. And I think I've always been interested in this because we think of cities adapting as if cities have the agency over their whole landscape, but the reality is they have very limited levers, and that's the land and property. And particularly in a state like Arizona, which really values the right of private property owners. Cities have to kind of dance around these rights and, encourage collaboration for the benefit of, current residents and future residents. And I think that may be something to really keep an eye on. What are the kind of mechanisms that are emerging in these contexts? And are they actually achieving those equity dimensions, foregrounding, the kind of rights of current residents? Who's being privileged in these negotiations? And I think, we'll see a variety of outcomes, but it's exciting to look at some of these and see if they may be models for moving forward.
Yeah, I love that the solutions, the bright spots that you all identified are so human. It's not some tech solution being parachuted in to make water not a problem. It's sort of just these old-fashioned, like, we need people to talk to each other. We need people to take responsibility for their role in the problem and the solution, and we need government to function and like
Well, that
um
bias of our expertise as we're interested in governance rather than the engineering. But certainly there's a lot of people talking about the, piping in water from Mexico, but we didn't really feel like that is the kind of practical direction and the most sustainable from the interviews that we've had. Yeah.
Well,
well,
and that's the interesting thing. We did actually ask people specifically, what do you perceive as the most viable solutions? And even if people would say, well, someday, if we have enough money, piping it in from, and then fill in your blank. Um, but they would never choose that one as the most viable. And so that was really interesting.
and as a sort of replicable model, I mean, we can't all pipe in from somewhere else, right? So
Well, and it
the
just
solution,
distributes the risk around. And, as, kind of sustainability scientists, we really need to be thinking about the externalities of our adaptation choices. And I think we can continue to kind of, uh, you know, um, disseminate or deflect the risk to places, but ultimately it comes back to haunt us because we are in the same system. And we are dependent on Mexico. Mexico is dependent on us in many different ways. Depriving water in one place is not going. It's going to have a lot of economic and demographic and implications that probably we don't need careful consideration. So learning to live within our means and how to manage this means effectively and equitably, I think is the real challenge. And I think the conversation has definitely started. We'll have to see where it goes. So.
Absolutely. So my last question is, what's next? What is next for the two of you in terms of your research agenda? And what do you feel might be next for Phoenix in terms of thinking through these problems, the problem of water, the question of water, and how to keep addressing it more and more effectively?
Well, I think for in Arizona, I think even one of our interviewees actually said, never waste a good, what was it, never waste a good crisis or
Yeah.
something, and
Yes.
I think that is something that has happened. There's definitely a lot of politics in this, and there's going to be, some things that are probably not as, what we might think of in a kind of sustainable direction posed and maybe implemented. But I think in general, the discussion about growth has surfaced. And it's not that growth is bad, but thinking about what kind of growth does this area want? Who benefits? Where do they benefit? And then I think really critically is the value of our resources, which have kind of, because we're in the desert and people kind of discount the ecological value of the desert. In fact, that was a interesting finding that Vanessa, I remember you pulling, you're like, no one talks about water for
Water.
ecological resources, and so, but we're beginning to see that. For example, the Colorado River Indian tribe, interestingly enough, just recently declared the Colorado River as having legal personhood rights. And so, in context of increasing competition for the rights that they have and that they can allocate. So they're saying, wait a minute here, there's another actor in this context that we need to consider as well. And so I think this is providing an opportunity to revalue relationships, our relationship to the desert, our relationship to water, and our relationship to each other, and whose interests are really benefiting from those relationships. Who is the city ultimately for? And I think it's kind of a really interesting laboratory to look at that. So I think I'm excited to kind of keep, this has been my first look most of my work is international, so, focusing on my own back door and backyard and seeing what's going on. So I'm excited to keep involved. And personally, and I think Vanessa is going to be, we're going to be pursuing these kinds of things, is looking at these issues of private actors and social contracts and how those are evolving in the kind of context of environmental stress, how these responsibilities are being renegotiated. And I am particularly interested in an environment where we seem to have lost track of the public good, how that can be kind of returned to the conversation through negotiations of the roles of all of us in the climate adaptation process. And, we have to figure out how we're going to achieve these kind of collective adaptation versus every property owner for themselves in this. And I think this is where we're seeing it. So I'm excited to start observing how these things play out. Water is a great way to look at it because it really requires that type of collaboration. So I'm going to continue to follow that in my research. And Vanessa?
Well, first thing I'd like to add on a piece to what Hallie was saying about it's not about not having growth, it's what kind of growth. And I'd like to add on how we go about that growth. Because are we going to continue glorifying urban sprawl, as one of our interviewees said, or are we going to think about how we go about growth in a very, very different way? And I think that that's really interesting because the social contracts, our relationships with each other and with the public, whether it's private or public government, that's going to impact how this happens. And I'm really interested in that. And I definitely will be continuing in the area of water. When I was in, because I just moved recently, so I'm at the University of Wyoming now. But when I was in working at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, I was looking at flooding. What was fascinating for me is many of the governance issues were the same as what Hallie and I were talking about for water scarcity. And so I'm interested in seeing if that's going to be similar here, where I'm looking at rural resilience and impacts of smoke and impacts of less snow melt and impacts of critical infra, or at least physical critical infrastructure changing because of our changing environmental circumstances. So that's the direction that I'm headed in, and also continue working with Hallie, and I'm really excited about that. So.
That is all really exciting and important research. This project was so much fun to sort of follow as you all were talking through what you were finding out in the field and then looking at your final deliverables. Really interesting project, and as we talked about, feels like a bit of a bellwether for so many other places. Whether it's water scarcity or repetitive flooding, subsidence. So there's so many environmental issues that we are confronting in one way or another all over the country and the world. So I want to thank you both, Professor Aiken, Professor Lewick, for doing this wonderful work. We were so happy to be able to support your research, and thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure. We really relish the opportunity to work together and to have this funding to get into the queue. So it's been a really great experience.